Well, hello, and look, lamb chop, rabbit, dinosaur are here waiting to hear the second half of Flat Stanley. So, without further ado, I will take out the magic ribbon and read the second half of Flat Stanley. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I will begin. So if you remember, Stanley and Arthur were in the park and Stanley had tied some string to him to fly himself as a kite. Wasn't that kind? Arthur let out the string and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his pale sweater and bright brown trousers against the bright blue sky. And there he is, and that's where we left him, wasn't it? Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left along matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again towards the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree and left Stanley flying in the sky. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it in the tree. Oh dear. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realise how low he was until the leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. There he is, all stuck in the tree. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologised, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realise what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." Oh dear, don't want to call her dear. She might get a bit cross. I would. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the flat just above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of a famous museum of art in the city. Stanley Lambchop had noticed in the lift that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy, but he had no idea what the reason was. And then at breakfast one morning he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup. "Yet another painting has been stolen from the famous museum at Toulouse-Lautrec." Now, Toulouse-Lautrec was a very famous French artist. And there's the dad reading his paper with his coffee, as they do. Mrs. Lambchop sipped her coffee. "That probably made it easy to steal," she said. "Being too loose, I mean." That was a joke, 'cause too loose to lose. Anyway, "It says," Mr. Lambchop went on, "that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wits' end. The police are no help. Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. 'We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying,' because all policemen were men back then. Now they're ladies too. 'Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where the signs say don't.'" How strange. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the lift. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It's very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day, and the famous museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head. Bing! Giving out little shooting lines of excitement, Stanley Lamchop had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother will give her permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lamchop gave her permission. "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall, where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat, playing a violin for a lady who lay on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them, and 3 fat children with wings were flying above. That's a very famous painting, but I don't know what it's called. That, Mr. Dart explained, was the most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," said Stanley. There's the famous painting with the violinist. Stanley Lamchop said, "And I brought one. My cowboy suit. It has a red bandana and I can tie it over my face. Nobody will recognise me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said, "you will have to wear the disguise I have chosen." From a closet he took a white dress with a blue sash and a pair of shiny pointed shoes, a wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had a blue ribbon on it. "This is a shepherdess disguise," Mr. Dart said. "You will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall." They were a bit posh, you see. Stanley was so disgusted that he could hardly speak. "I shall look like a girl, that's what I shall look like," he said. "I wish I never had my idea." There he is, showing him the costume. Oh dear. But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb up into the empty picture frame. Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had cleverly put 4 small spikes in the wall, 1 for each hand and foot. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture. "Except for one thing," Mr. Dart said. "Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky. You look fierce, not happy, Stanley." Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes and even to smile a little bit, probably like this. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a moment. "Well," he said, "it may not be art, but I know what I like." He went off to make sure that certain other parts of Stanley's plan were being taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. There he is, dressed up like a shepherdess. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed and he got tireder and tireder. Anyone would be tired this late at night, especially if he had to stand in a picture frame balanced on little spikes. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter too in the darkness. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle beneath the golden curls of his wig. Creak. The creaking sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw in the same place a tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, and the glow got bigger. A trapdoor had opened in the floor, and 2 men came up through it into the hall. Look at that. Wow. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trapdoor entrance into the museum from outside. That was why they had never been caught, and now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He kept very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. "This is it, Max," said the first one. "This is where we art robbers pull a sensational job while the whole civilized community sleeps." "Right, Luther," said the other man. "In this great city there is no one to suspect us." "Ha ha," thought Stanley Lambchop. "That's what you think." The sneak thieves put down their lantern and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. "What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max?" the first man asked. "We would kill him. What else?" his friend replied. That was enough to frighten Stanley, and he was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. "This sheep girl," Luther said. "I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared." Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes again and to smile, sort of. "You're crazy, Luther," Max said. "She's smiling, and what a pretty thing she is, too." That made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back to the world's most expensive painting, and then he shouted in his loudest voice, his most terrifying voice, "Police! Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here!" There they are, the sneak thieves in the light. The sneak thieves looked at each other. "Max," said the first one, "I think I heard the sheep girl yell." "I think I did too," said Max in a quivery voice. "Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest." "You'll get a rest, all right," shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind him. "You'll get arrested, that's what. Ha ha." The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the policeman to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all the papers. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name, and everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Harriet, over there." There's the policeman catching the baddies. And there's Stanley, flat hero. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves, and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering and the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change. There they are, all looking at him. And it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. People are mean, aren't they, sometimes? You mustn't ever shout at people because of the way they look. He didn't choose to look that way, did he? Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me any more because I'm different, flat." "Shame on them," said Mrs. Lambchop. "It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes." See, just what I said. "Or their religion for that matter, or the colour of their skin." Exactly. "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. He was crying. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me, Arthur." "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled that day. The day you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley, please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a proper shape again, like other people, but I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." Oh, Stanley, Arthur said. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. Don't talk about what I just said, Stanley told him. I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse. You're brave, Arthur said. You really are. He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat in the darkness being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. That was nice and kind. And then, suddenly, he was not, even though he was trying not to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where the toys and things were kept. He began to rummage in the box. Can you see what he got? Look at that. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and aeroplane models and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, Aha! He had found just what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up and Stanley and he looked at each other. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and clamped his lips tightly about it so that no air could escape. I'll go slowly, said Arthur. If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand at me. He began to pump. At first nothing happened, except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped on. Then suddenly Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. There, he's getting fatter instead of flatter. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside him more easily. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons of his pyjama top burst off. Pop, pop, pop. A moment more and he was all rounded out. Head, body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a shake would help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one, and there stood Stanley Lampchop, just as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. There we are. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lampchop strode into the room, and Mrs. Lampchop right behind him. We heard you, said Mr. Lampchop, up and talking when you ought to be asleep, eh? Shame on... George, said Mrs. Lampchop, Stanley's round again. You're right, said Mr. Lampchop, noticing. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy. Of course, Mrs. Lampchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lampchop took the boys back into their beds and kissed them good night. They turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon, all the Lampchops were asleep. And there they are with their hot chocolate. Because we know, I know, and you know, that there's nothing like hot chocolate to make things better. So that was quite long, wasn't it? We had a long time there. And that's the end of Flat Stanley. Tomorrow we'll have a different story. So, here we go. Say goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Say goodbye to these two here. We'll be back tomorrow. Okay. Goodbye, children.